Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Donnell, and I'm president of Enterprise Health. And I'd like to welcome you to Shining a Light on Occupational Health. And this is a webinar focused on building a better business case for investment in occupational and employee health initiatives, and that includes an underlying digital infrastructure. And this is actually the fifth in a series of webinars that we initiated earlier this year in response to COVID-19. We've got about 145 individuals who registered for today's session, so we appreciate all of you making time to attend. We also want to thank our friends at the Institute for Health and Productivity Management for helping us to promote this event. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We've muted everybody except our moderators and panelists on entry, so we minimize background noise. We're also recording this session, so we will email everyone early next week with a link to access the recording. And we put together a really outstanding panel for today, and it's a group of occupational and employee health experts who include some of our clients, advisors, partners, and we've asked each panelist to make some initial remarks about their observations on today's topic, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A session. And you could submit questions via the chat feature in WebEx, and then we'll get to as many as we possibly can, and feel free to submit those along the way, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. Joining me today to help moderate is Dr. Bhargav Chandrasekhar. Bhargav is an occupational health physician at GlaxoSmithKline, and he also serves on our advisory board. And thank you, Bhargav, for joining us today. Before we turn it over to the panelists, I'm going to give some quick context on our organization and today's topic. And if you were unfortunate enough to be trapped in an elevator with me, and you ask me who is Enterprise Health, this is what I'd say. We're the only cloud-based health IT solution that combines occupational health and compliance, clinical care and employee engagement on a single, interoperable, and certified electronic health record platform, helping to equip our enterprise clients and their employees for a healthier future. And we work with a mix of blue-chip global corporations, government agencies, as well as hospitals and health systems who both operate their own on-site employee health clinics and also provide employee health services to other organizations. And a few weeks ago, I was on a call with a prospective client at a large health system in the Northeast. And this health system is getting ready to deploy our COVID-19 response capability as rapidly as possible, and they'll then implement Enterprise Health in full. And our contact there made kind of an interesting comment. And she said, I almost hate to say this, but I'm almost glad that COVID came along because it's demonstrated to our leadership how woefully inadequate our employee health IT infrastructure is, and we now recognize the need to invest in better technology. And we've heard this same sentiment from several other organizations in the last 30 to 45 days. And in the considerable wake of COVID-19, there's certainly heightened recognition of the critically important role of occupational and employee health as organizations wrestle with widespread return to work and all of the issues that go with that. And actually, as my co-moderator Bhargav recently pointed out to me, people now realize that employee health does more than just tell you to eat less salt, and it's certainly about time. But in some ways, there's actually never been a better time to make the business case for increased investment in occupational health initiatives. However, that business case has to be made at a time of great economic uncertainty that's also fueled by COVID-19. So kind of your traditional return on investment calculus isn't really adequate. So to paraphrase the boat captain from the movie Jaws, we're going to need a better business case. So in preparation for today's webinar, we've worked with our advisors and some of our clients and other folks to put together a list of 7 better business case elements, many of which will be addressed today by our panelists. And we're actually putting together some detailed content on this, including a guidebook and a presentation slide deck and script that you will all be able to use to make your own business case in your organizations, and we'll be sending that out to everybody who attends today. But a quick summary of those 7 elements, and number 1 is employee trust, and it's no coincidence that that's at the top of the list. Because thanks to COVID-19, you've got employees all over the globe who are understandably scared to return to and remain at work, and creating a safe and healthy workplace environment has never been more important. Second is protected and secure health information, and we're seeing an unprecedented flow of employee health information, again, thanks to COVID, that's coming into the workplace. But it's often winding up in the hands of individuals who don't really have the expertise, authority, or tools to handle that data. So securely managing information is essential to build employee trust and to stay out of hot water. Third is lost production or revenue. And as we've seen, most office workers can continue to operate remotely, but you can't run a factory, a processing plant, a hospital, or a lab without having healthy workers on site. And as we've seen, a single day of lost production and revenues can be devastating, and even reducing your run rates can impair your cost of goods sold. Fourth is risk mitigation and avoidance. And historically, occupational health programs were put in place for compliance purposes to minimize risk. But today, a lack of occupational health programming and a robust health IT infrastructure dramatically increases that risk. And make no mistake, law firms are already starting to advertise to generate class action lawsuits against employers who they have determined don't have adequate protections and programs in place. And that'll be with us for some time to come. Fifth is streamlined automation. And if you're going to effectively manage and interact with your employee populations, you've got to have strong digital tools, and especially in a socially distanced world where technology can help to bridge that gap. And without things like employee portals, mobile apps, telehealth, digital integration with medical devices, and secure health information technology, you're in a tough spot. Number 6 is scalability. And we found, as we've interacted with prospective new clients, especially over the last 45 days, we keep hearing the same thing. That we tried to manage COVID-19 employee monitoring and return to work on spreadsheets, and it is a not humanly possible nightmare. And that's on top of managing medical surveillance, worksite injury and illness, clinical care, and of course, as people have been off of work, you have this backlog of required tests and exams that have stacked up. And the final business case element is a best-in-class partner. And when it comes to looking at health technology, it's important to find a partner that has really a laser focus on occupational and employee health. And that partner should combine both comprehensive employee health functionality with the ability to operate in an incredibly agile manner, because this pandemic is forcing all of us to make almost daily adjustments to respond to this dynamic situation. So with that as context, what we'd like to do is hear from each of our panelists. And leading off today is Kel Udeala, and Kel is an industry analyst at Verdantix. And Verdantix is a firm that studies the broad environmental health and safety, or EHS, market. And they recently published a great study projecting growth rates for occupational health software, and he's going to share some insights from that. So Kel, let me pull your slides up real quick.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I appreciate being given a platform to discuss our research and forecast covering occupational health software and IT. So we recently published our global market size and forecast covering IH and OH software, and this report helps executives at software vendors, EHS service providers, and investors focused on IH and OH software to understand the current state and size of the market. Before I discuss the impact of COVID-19 with regard to fueling the IHOH software market, I'd just like to highlight a few notable insights from our report. If you could please go to the next slide. Building from previous research covered in our Global Corporate Survey 2019, covering budgets, priorities, and tech preferences, we asked 403 EHS decision makers the extent to which they intend to use EHS software in 2020. What we saw was that 34% intended to use IHOH and ergonomic software widely across all operations, while 43% intended to use it at multiple facilities. Next slide, please. With this in mind, I'd also like to point out that our recent market size and forecast report states that the global spend on IH and OH software is expected to reach $253 million in 2020. And looking at the chart there, North America and Europe will contribute 78% to this global spend, with North America contributing 51% or $129 million, and Europe accounting for 27% or equivalent of $68 million in spending. Next slide, please. With regard to this total spend of $253 million in 2020, let's say very high risk industries will account for 48% or an equivalent of $121 million. And high risk and medium risk industries will account for 22% and 25% of this spend, or I would say $55 million and $64 million respectively. Also note that from the total spend of $253 million, $152 million or a 60% share of this total spend will cover occupational health software. Next slide, please. So overall, we project that the IHOH software spend will grow at a compound annual growth rate of 9.7% to reach $403 million by 2025. However, the year-on-year growth rate will vary during the 2020 to 2025 forecast period. The years 2021 and 2022 are forecasted to see a growth rate of 6% and 7% respectively. 2023 is forecasted to experience a rate of up to 11%. Finally culminating in a growth rate from 2024 to 2025 of 12%. North America and Europe will maintain dominance in market share in 2025, with North America accounting for 50% or an equivalent of $200 million of global spend. However, economic uncertainties from the impact of COVID-19 negatively affecting GDP will result in Europe growing slightly more than North America with a compound annual growth rate of 9%. But Europe is projected to maintain its 26% or $104 million of the global spend in 2025. Now, looking at the Asia Pacific regions, the Gulf states and Africa, these regions are projected to have a compound annual growth rate of 10% between 2020 and 2025. This high growth rate is fueled by increasing focus on worker health and safety, and also uptake by first-time adopters of IHOH software in these regions. And COVID-19 is projected to affect some industries in these regions, like oil and gas industry negatively, but we would expect to see a rebound and increase in adoption because of the quickly growing African market. Slide 6, next slide, please. So let's consider the driving forces behind this global growth rate. Previously, the driving force was mostly due to emerging regional adoption and growing demand for occupational health software to better manage worker health and exposure. But currently, successfully managing COVID-19 is a major factor in fueling this growth. And it is important to point out that the pandemic will be a long-term positive growth factor for IH and OH software demand. And firms are now realizing the critical importance of a robust occupational health management system supported by a robust IT infrastructure. Because of the way business has to be conducted now, firms are directing efforts on monitoring and managing worker exposure and health via various tools, including self-assessment questionnaires, travel management, and PPE tracking tools, just to name a few. And in the past, these are areas of occupational health usually seen as tick box exercises to maintain compliance. But now they're in demand more than ever to mitigate the proliferation of the pandemic. And firms are adopting new techniques they have never used before to mitigate the pandemic. Some of these use cases cover contact tracing and telehealth proctoring. We're seeing firms tying in OH software capabilities with many aspects of their enterprise systems, even firms within historically low-risk industries within, say, office spaces. For instance, I know of a firm that manages office spaces, and over the past couple of months have become very interested in implementing pandemic management tools to tie in with their business operations as people return to work. And also, while budgets are under intense scrutiny, firms are postulating that invested in occupational health software with capabilities to help manage the pandemic is a requirement for business continuity and hence an important part of their strategy moving forward. And it is apparent that any firm that does not invest in occupational health software to manage the pandemic and have a future pandemic response toolkit will lag behind. The pandemic will also have a long-term positive impact on the support and IT infrastructure for occupational health software as firms increasingly desire tools that can, easily integrate with different aspects of their management systems from HR to legal. So to qualitatively summarize, the insights we can glean from the data we've collected are: first one, occupational health is no longer a tick box exercise for compliance, and COVID-19 is driving firms to consider and adopt capabilities that fall under the remit of occupational health software. Firms within industries that give very little attention to occupational health software, such as office space management firms, are turning to the software because of COVID-19. Firms are looking at how they can bolster the support and IT infrastructure for their OH software tools and make it work synergistically with all aspects of their management systems, including, like I mentioned before, human resources and legal. And software spending for IH and OH is projected to reach $253 million in 2020. And software spending for IH and OH is projected to reach $403 million by 2025. And I'd say it's also worth keeping in mind the regions with high projected compound annual growth rates, such as the APAC regions, the Gulf states, and Africa. And one last thing before I finish, Verdantix offers several guides to selecting the appropriate software for firms' safety and operational needs. And we have guides for selecting occupational health software too. I believe attendees will receive a guide as a follow-up to this webinar. So having said that, thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Great, thank you very much, Kel. Wonderful job, and that does a great job of really setting the stage for the rest of our speakers. And so with that, next up is Dr. Paul Gannon. Dr. Gannon is the Global Medical Director for Corteva AgriScience, where he's responsible for managing occupational and employee health for about 20,000 people in more than 140 countries. Dr. Gannon?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeff. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks to you, Jeff, for giving me this opportunity to talk to the audience a little bit about Corteva AgriScience. It's a relatively new company, how we went about building a business case for employee health in this new company, and then how that organization has fared during the first year of Corteva, but then also how it's fared during the COVID-19 crisis. So you'd be forgiven for not recognizing the name of Corteva AgriScience. Hopefully you do, but just in case you don't feel too bad, but you probably do recognize the parents of Corteva, and this was Dow and DuPont. And back in December 2016, really quite a long time ago now, it was announced that Dow and DuPont would merge, and then they would demerge, creating three companies, the new Dow, the new DuPont, and then this new company made up of all the agri-science, crop protection and seed businesses from both Dow and DuPont to form Corteva. And Corteva launched on the New York Stock Exchange on the 3rd of June last year. So we're literally, we've recently had our first birthday with a lot of virtual celebrations. We plan to do a lot of things in person, but COVID-19 interrupted that. So hopefully it'll be interesting for you to hear a little bit about this company. If we go to the next slide. So as Jeff says, it's a $14 billion sales company with 20,000 employees spread really right across the world, 140 different countries. So that's made it really quite interesting to handle this COVID-19 pandemic. It's headquartered in the US, in Wilmington, Delaware. Many of our employees are based at two main business centers in Indiana and also in Iowa. But we have a presence in Latin America, a very important region for us, Europe, Middle East and Africa, also very important, and Asia, very much a growing region. So as I say, it's a global company, it's an agriculture company, and it was very important to take both those facts into account when we were designing our medical service. So if we go to the next slide. So agri-science, it might be a new term to you. You might be more familiar with the terms like agriculture, but it's a very good term, because if we're going to feed the growing global population, which is set to reach 9 billion by 2050, we really are going to have to use science to help us improve yields in terms of our crops, if we're not going to increase the amount of land that's dedicated to farming and reduce the amount of land that's dedicated to things like forests, which nobody wants to reduce further. So the science that Corteva applies to agriculture is both in the seed, in terms of normal hybrid seeding, breeding, or biotech. It's actually on the seed. These days, it's not just the seed that goes into the ground, but it's coated with many different things to increase the chance that it actually germinates. And then once the seed starts to grow, obviously there's various products that are classed as crop protection. And also in a very new area, which took me a little bit of time to understand, is digital agronomy. And if somebody wants to ask me a question about that later on, I'll happily answer that, but it probably would take up the full time that I'm allocated if I started talking about it now. So if we go to the next slide. So I was originally the chief medical officer for DuPont, and I took the opportunity to move to this new company because I thought it was a great challenge of setting up a medical service from scratch, really from a clean slate or a clean sheet of paper for what was effectively a global agri-science $14 billion startup company. So it was really a very exciting time. There was a lot of enthusiasm to take from our heritage companies what was good. But given that both Dow and DuPont were over 100 years old, there was also a desire not to bring over some of the things maybe that had collected along that over 100-year history. So in terms of making the business case for the new health function, it was very important for me, but also, from the managers of Corteva to understand, what was good, what did we want to keep, but also what did we want to improve on in terms of what the heritage companies had in terms of organization, but also programs that were offered in this area of employee health. So certainly there was things that were necessary to keep due to local legal legislation, a lot of programs related to occupational health, programs related to our duty of care in terms of travel medicine. And again, thinking about that global extent of the company, a lot of our employees are in sub-Saharan Africa or visiting that region. Travel medicine is clearly very important to make sure our people who travel there stay safe, and also for our local employees there. I think everybody gets employee well-being, both physical and mental, in terms of why that's important for a company from a productivity and absenteeism point of view. But particularly for an agriculture company, business support, particularly to product stewardship, is very important. Clearly, there's a lot of care taken to ensure that crop protection materials that are released onto the market are safe and are well tested and well studied. And our employee health experience is a big part of those product submissions. So working with product stewardship in the development of that was going to be very important for an agri-science company compared to a standard chemical or material science company. Also, governance was very important. An agriculture company has some large locations, but many of the locations would be considered small by other company standards. In fact, a site of 100 people is probably quite large now for Corteva, whereas we use that as the definition of a small site in DuPont days. And therefore, these smaller locations are served by contract health providers. And so it's important that there's some way of keeping track on what sort of health services are being provided by these providers, ensuring that they're either providing too little or too much. We've had examples of both over the years. Very important part of a global organization, and this was really one of the most satisfying parts of setting up the new health services. It gave me the opportunity to hire some new people. With a long history in a large multinational, it had been a long time since we were hiring people and not downsizing people. So this was a really great opportunity. And what I wanted to really make clear was that, we shouldn't put all our corporate resources in the headquarters in an office building in Delaware. Given that this was a global company, it was very important to put those resources where we needed them. So our model really was to have two health resources, usually a doctor and a nurse, or a doctor and a more junior doctor in each of the regions. So we have a doctor and a nurse in North America, 2 doctors in Latin America, 2 doctors in Asia Pacific, and working with myself in the EMEA region, we have a nurse in South Africa. So it was very, very important, and you'll see later on that really came into its own when we've been dealing with COVID, having people in the right location. In addition to that, we knew that systems were going to be very important. It's a small corporate organization, so having the right systems in place, including electronic medical records, needed us to really hire a specialist in systems management. So not a doctor or nurse who liked to do that as a hobby, somebody who really specialized and had a good track record in implementing systems, from electronic ones to other required systems. So as part of that corporate organization, we added a 9th role as a systems manager. It was very important for us to have a global electronic medical record system. This is something I believed in for all my career. It's not always been easy to get the necessary support to implement that, but both our heritage companies had implemented electronic medical records to a greater or lesser extent. So it really was a good opportunity to say, hey, let's build on what our heritage companies have done and introduce a single, simple, off-the-shelf, non-customized electronic medical record system, which will really help us in terms of providing metrics about the health of our organization, but also, support that governance process in making that robust, so we understand what is happening around the world, which really wouldn't be possible other than using a good system. Looking back, it might have been prescient, but I was quite involved in leading the pandemic and infectious diseases planning process in DuPont, and I was very keen to bring that across into Corteva, again, because of the global reach of the company and working in some areas where we had potential risks like Ebola or Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus, Zika yellow fever in Latin America, or even avian influenza in Asia Pacific. Obviously, that really came into its own, and I was so glad that I'd made that decision when COVID-19 arrived. All this was developed with a journey partner, and I think we'll be hearing from Samir, who represents Environmental Resource Management, ERM. They were a great help in putting this strategy together, and as you'll see later on, introducing our electronic medical records globally. So if we go to the next slide, Jeff. So this is just a very nice graphic which shows the range of services that are offered within Corteva, all the way from the left-hand side, which very much focuses on prevention, where we all want to be focusing, but realizing at some occasions we do have to get into the treatment area, occupational disability management. So just a nice spectrum of the services we provide. So next slide. So as I mentioned, as part of this setup of the new health service, we introduced a new electronic medical record system. Neither of the heritage companies really use this system. One of the heritage companies used something completely different. The other one did use a forerunner of enterprise health, but a very customized version of it. And I think one of the key learnings about electronic medical records is if you customize, it's very difficult to upgrade to the latest version. So we found that that particular heritage company had a much older version of it. So we really made that decision with the help of ERM to go with the off-the-shelf version of the product to make sure that we could keep that updated. Obviously, there was a whole project plan, and I'm so pleased that we were able to have an external journey partner in ERM to help us with this, and particularly Samir, who's on the call today. I can't thank him enough for the help that he gave us in terms of coming up with things like the project plans that you can see there on the slide to allow us to implement the electronic medical record system. You can see it's not in 140 different countries. Obviously, we were working against a very fixed timeline of the company separating off from its heritage parents of Dow and DuPont. So there was the date of the 3rd of June 2019 was a hard and fast one. We had to have systems up and running. So these were the countries where we had most importance and most employees from a Corteva perspective, but also where the heritage companies have been using electronic medical records. So we focused on these countries, and now we have a little bit more time to consider where else we might implement enterprise health. So it was complex, but we did achieve the objective. So if we go to the next slide. So I've been working in multinational occupational health for 25 years. And one of the things I've always wanted to do during that time is get to the point where there was a health metric on the scorecard that the CEO used on a regular basis. And it has been such a challenge. It sounds so simple to us. I know I'm preaching to the choir with the people on the call, but establishing the electronic medical record system has actually allowed me to fulfill that goal, and I'm so happy about that. You can see on this scorecard that our CEO uses regularly. There's the usual injury, illness, process safety, motor vehicle. Under the red arrow, it's actually security, but now you can see we have the 5th metric for health, and this is going to evolve over time. At the moment, we're starting off relatively simple. We're just telling our leaders and the rest of the organization how much our services are used. And what we see here is for 3 months data from Enterprise Health for the 3 key regions where we're live at the moment: US, LATAM, APAC, representing nearly 10,000 consultations. Also very interesting to our managers, and particularly our direct manager, our executive vice president, was, are we supporting people with their day-to-day issues and helping them stay at work? And we were able to say that yes, as always should be the case. The majority of our consultations are directly related to occupation, but 42% are personal health. And the percentage of personal health consultations obviously goes up when we're dealing with countries in Asia, Pacific, and Latin America, where primary healthcare is not developed to the same extent that it is, for example, in North America. So I was very pleased to achieve that objective, and I'm sure any of you who've been trying to get a metric like this displayed regularly by your senior management will understand the pleasure that I felt in achieving that objective. So if we go to the next slide. So, how has this design fared, generally speaking, and I think I've covered that with achieving the metric on the previous slide, but how has it fared through the test of COVID? Well, obviously, the fact that we had a good pandemic and infectious disease process in place was extremely helpful. And just by coincidence, I'd worked with the rest of the health team to update all those documents that had come over from Heritage DuPont to be as we call Corteverized, and we'd done that just before the end of last year. And over the Christmas period, really, we started seeing the reports coming out of China about this new virus, and that process of monitoring infectious diseases risks allowed us to give early warning to management at the beginning of January 2020. There was a little bit of so what, but once I explained how this could be a potential issue because it's a new virus, we don't have immunity to it, it could spread quite rapidly, they were very quick to get on board as the potential risk for this, and that really enabled us to not only source supplies to protect our employees, but to achieve business continuity with that early warning. As I mentioned, we had a whole range of pandemic and infectious diseases guidelines, all designed to meet the needs of an influenza pandemic. Clearly, this was a coronavirus pandemic, but in actual fact, it was very easy to change those straight over to meet the needs of coronavirus, and also, obviously, what we learned really on a day-to-day basis as we got to know more and more about COVID-19. Very important, as I mentioned earlier, was the position of our health resources. This really gave us on-the-ground information. We had a doctor based in Shanghai in China, was able to give us good on-the-ground information, understanding the local culture, restrictions, and politics. That was really valued by management. I can't say how much that was valued, but also by the local managers and also the local employees. It was much more important for them that they had somebody local they could trust who understood their position rather than we're from Wilmington and we're here to help type situation, which doesn't always go down too well. From an electronic medical records point of view, I still think we're in the infancy of how we can use the system to help us, but it was certainly important to help us assess the global impact of COVID-19 on our workforce as the virus progressed around the world. And that was especially important for an agriculture or agri-science company because we were classed as essential. So most of our factories and seed facilities actually continued to operate, even in those countries that were very locked down, because obviously being considered as part of the food chain is really essential. So it was, it wasn't a matter of let's close up shop and all work from home. We had to keep those manufacturing locations open. And I think it will also be very important to helping us monitor the health of the workforce as we go through this return to work site as COVID-19 wanes in different localities. You'll notice return to work site. We were all very keen not to call it return to work because, of course, all of us who've been working at home have been working very hard. So it's not that we're returning to work, it's just we're returning to work on our sites. So I think the next slide is the final slide, if I remember correctly. So this is the final slide then. So, I think it's very important to, when you're, either modifying or proposing a change to a health service, and particularly when you're setting up a new health service, that you build a multifaceted business case. It's not all about money, it's about value as well. And I think the most important thing from a management perspective is they see that you're proposing something that is specific for their company, and certainly an agriculture company is not a standard company, and a global company working in some really quite challenging parts of the world is not run-of-the-mill. So we needed to design something specific for that particular needs and then seasonal needs of an agriculture company, and have people in the right place around the world. And showing, as we have done over the first year of Corteva, that the design is fit for purpose on a day-to-day basis, as shown by our metrics, has been very important and well received. But having an organization that can rise to the challenge of a crisis is even more important. And, clearly, as we heard from the previous speaker, occupational health is front and center now. I don't think I've ever had more compliments from my management, for myself and for the team that support me as I've had in the last few months. So it's not a great thing, and we wouldn't wish it to happen, but it's really brought to the forefront, what having an effective employee health service can bring to a company in terms of supporting the employees, but also maintaining business continuity. So back to you, Jeff.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent, and really helpful to get some insights into into how a global organization is dealing with all of this. So much appreciated. Okay, next up is Samir Menon, and Samir is a partner at ERM. And ERM is a global environmental health and safety consulting firm. Samir works with organizations around the world who are right now wrestling with how do they keep their employees safe and healthy in the wake of COVID-19. So take it away, Samir.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff and Enterprise Health, for again giving me the opportunity and the platform. I'm going to be one of those odd one out where I'm a consultant without any slides. So you can just see what COVID-19 makes us do. So I'm gonna probably speak on a couple of key areas. You've heard some of these mentioned by Kel and by Paul earlier. The three areas I really want to kind of focus on is just the changing company perceptions of for both EHS and occupational health, and you heard Paul outline it brilliantly in terms of just the impact on operations and the enhancement in profile. I also want to talk a little bit about the ideas of developing the business case, and again, you can see how the current environment is impacting the light on occupational health, as Jeff called it, but the need to really be multifaceted, and how do you kind of balance these sometimes diverging forces. And then the last part is I want to talk a little bit about some of the support that we've been asked to provide. Some of our clients have been working through it. And as Paul identified, I started working on just tracking some of these activities with some of our clients using their individual EMRs or other dashboards and systems in early January. And I think it's been really interesting just to see what has helped certain organizations be more successful dealing with the challenge. And I think that's going to be an important factor for people to consider and keep in mind as they think about the business case. So I think in just with kind of dealing with the three areas that I just mentioned, I'm going to kind of focus the key themes I want to really talk about are, one, I believe digital or being digital native is really the next normal for occupational health. I think if there's one thing this pandemic has really demonstrated is trying to do this by spreadsheet. I mean, forget about the superhuman strength aspect, but it's just it brings a level of risk for the company. So I want to talk a little bit about just the importance of digital. The second theme I want to kind of refer to really is when a number of these business cases are based on what I call cost or risk avoidance, that just makes for a challenging business case. So how do we kind of rethink of how we structure the playing field almost, or structure the perspective? So that's the second thing. And then the last thing I want to really talk about is as we're dealing with this and we're looking at new technologies and new ways of doing things and moonshots. I think we're forgetting some of the fundamentals. And so I think I want to kind of leave you with that third theme, which is sticking to the fundamentals, especially when you're in the eye of a storm, is probably really good advice. So let me start with the first one, which is digital kind of being the new normal. I think as Paul kind of identified earlier, the virtual worker got very real. I mean, it's a new reality that everyone is facing. Obviously, there were essential workers who had to continue to do what they do, but in a number of cases, you have flexible locations, and then there are implications that come with that. I remember a client we were working with where we were doing this massive ergonomic assessment exercise for their global facilities, and about 3 months ago, they essentially stopped it because there was nobody in the facilities anymore. Everybody was at work. I was at home potentially. For them, they had a few factories, but they were not considered essential, so a large percentage was working from home. But what they found was, with the increase in some of the work-related musculoskeletal disorders, they had to restart the ergo assessment, but now focus on a home office perspective, because in a number of cases, as a number of you are familiar on this phone, the setups that were done in the home offices were far from ergonomically approved or ergonomically good. So there was a whole new set of things that enterprise health and safety, and particularly occupational health, had to think about. Psychological well-being was another one. Employee assistance programs and how to fund them and keep them consistent and effective have always been a challenge with a lot of the occupational health programs. But now this became front and center in terms of helping organizations deal with some of those new realities and new challenges. The other thing that was kind of clear was also just better visualization of the data, which just allowed you to make more effective key decisions. And I think the driver of this kind of digital impact was EHS and occupational health, as Paul just kind of highlighted, got a seat on the table. And it's not just a temporary seat that kind of happens when a disaster occurs. So it wasn't disaster planning anymore. This was starting to become more potentially permanent in my mind, because it's impacting the occupational risk management, is impacting business continuity. It's impacting how the organization will work. We've always spoken about a healthy worker being a productive worker, but this was actually proving the fact. And I think what was really interesting in our minds is the organizations that hadn't fully embraced the digitalization of some of these critical functions were really struggling to respond to some of this rapid change. And I think, again, the Corteva example is a great one. We had another one where we were working with a global pharmaceutical client who were looking to put in some of the track, trace, and contact tracing activities in place. And the fact that they already had an existing EMIS platform that we were able to leverage to build this allowed us to do it in a way that was security compliant, GDPR compliant, privacy compliant, but still allowed them to achieve their objectives. But if they didn't have that system in the first place, it was going to be almost impossible to achieve that result. The second theme that I kind of talked about was just the whole, developing of the business case. And in a number of cases, occupational health and EHS business cases are sometimes driven by some of the cost or the risk avoidance. So the risk mitigation aspects that Jeff mentioned right at the beginning: employee trust, data security, loss production. So these are all, if we don't put this in place, then this might happen. And sometimes that becomes a difficult business case to make. And we typically find you need to have a trigger, either a transaction or a transition, or sometimes a transgression, which actually then allows you to make that case more effective. And it allows you to point to, look, if we don't have the system in place, here's what might happen. And I think in the current environment, we're finding many more willing ears, just as Jeff highlighted in the early quote that he referred to, a lot of great initial conversations where they say, look, this is really providing us the the appropriate points to make that conversation, make the business case, but you have the opposing force of the economic conditions that make the final business case difficult to do. So we have great initial conversations, but not always translating to full implementations. And I believe a couple of things that I think are critical to help make that effective business case is really starting to look at some peer or sector comparisons. So being able to point to either something that has gone well or something that hasn't gone well, and appealing to that perspective, to really demonstrate the value of the business case that we're actually putting together. The second one, I think, is, Paul referred to it a little bit on the multifaceted piece, going more from money to value, is really thinking about expanding the scope. I think the amazing thing that has happened in the last 6 months with EHS and particularly occupational health is it's not just an occupational health question anymore. It is impacting operations, it is impacting sustainability, it is impacting supply chain. And so it's important that you become entrepreneurs a little bit within your organization to look for what those alternate sources of funding might be, because you're providing a service which is not just to the employee and ensuring that they stay healthy and you're maintaining compliance, but you're actually providing strategic services to a broader cross section of the business. And it's important to A, demonstrate that, and B, make sure you get the appropriate the coalition of the willing almost to be able to expand the scope of your budget to really get some of get the business case approved. The other thing is again, don't jump to the final step in the first go. And this is kind of, I'll refer to this again when I come to my sticking to the fundamentals. The idea really is to make sure you have a phased approach which is demonstrating value at each step, so that the business is essentially asking for give me more and why not rather than what. And I think it's critical to do that expectation management internally. The last point I wanted to kind of mention here is really that last aspect of kind of sticking to the fundamentals. I mean, the moonshots are critical and they're important, and it's really great that we have people who are doing that. We need to make sure some of these fundamentals are in place. Things like the importance of privacy and security, which again Jeff highlighted initially. The importance of simplicity. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. The need for that integrated team. The importance of good data. And I think the last one, which I referred to in my earlier point, is kind of making sure you're reaching your goal in rapid but incremental steps. You're not going to go from 0 to 100 in 60 seconds. That's not going to work. But by demonstrating the layered or the phased approach, I think you win more converts to your side, and you're more successful at actually implementing what we're trying to do. So I think in conclusion, I think we really have a rare opportunity to proactively shape what I'd call our next normal, or risk having it thrust upon us. So I think those are some of the things, or fundamentals that I would think of as you look at developing and getting your business case approved.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And last but certainly not least is Eric Zimmerman. And Eric is actually the Chief Innovation and Commercialization Officer with Kumanu. And Kumanu works with organizations and their employees to build purpose. And they've developed some really unique ways to understand and act on employee sentiment. So let me turn control over to you, Eric, and then you can bring up the slides.
Super, Jeff. Thanks for that. Yeah, if you could just authorize me to share slides, I will bring those up presently. Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Happy to kind of bat cleanup with this auspicious crew, and bear with me while I do the WebEx dance. Jeff, is that showing up okay?
Yes.
Beautiful. Okay. I think I'm going to begin this with kind of an ode to Monty Python now for something completely different, but I'm going to connect the dots back to these concepts of occupational health, employee health, surveillance, And I really want to kind of pick up the thread of what Samir just said about value creation and a broader view and measuring at each step. And in particular, the fact that we're in a situation where the issues of COVID are not just the issues of COVID. In fact, some have talked about this second wave, and I don't just mean a second wave of COVID infections, but this tsunami of emotional and mental health issues coming right behind. And how do we really understand what's going on in the hearts and minds of our people? So I'm going to talk really briefly about three things and then allow us get to the Q&A part of this webinar session. The first is this a thing? I come at this with the lens of a behavior scientist. We are a healthcare company. Dr. Bob Carr is our chief medical officer. He's, a luminary, immediate past president of the American College of Preventive Medicine. We really do have a serious health lens on this. Purpose, I will posit, is probably the single most important risk factor and health determinant that you're not measuring, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Secondly, I'm going to talk about surveillance at an additional level that goes to the substrate of what people are feeling and what they're doing. And in that context, I'll say that I think one of the biggest issues we have is that getting our way out of this situation obviously will require great, diligent healthcare services and surveillance, but it also requires focus on human behavior. And as has been said by a good friend of mine at Stanford, human behavior is not rocket science, it's actually harder. We're not always rational. So how do we create the desired behavior? So we're going to touch on these three topics today. And so purpose, you may remember from high school or college reading Viktor Frankl and this man's search for meaning and this amazing story about medical care in a setting that's just horrific, and how do you find your way out of that? With that said, fast forward to today, you may be surprised to learn that there have been actually now over 800 peer-reviewed studies where the independent risk factor being measured is a sense of purpose. Now, what is that? Can you quantify it? Is it a thing? In fact, it is. And if you were to dip into that literature, you would find that, again, if you could take this construct of purpose, this sort of psychosocial idea of having a sense of determination, a life goal, something you're moving toward, you would find that that is highly predictive of things like better sleep, better diabetic management, actually antibody production, longevity, DNA repair. There's some amazing Nobel Prize-winning research about the telomeres that protect our chromosomes, as well as reduced likelihood of various kinds of health outcomes, ranging from cardiovascular disease to things that are more important in the moment: cognitive conflict, fear response. Am I going to wear a mask? Am I going to wash my hands? Am I going to do the things I need to do as an individual member of this community? So we're very interested in the impact of this construct and how we can surveil it, as well as how people are doing in this moment. So what are the pathways? We're not going to do a semester-long course, but I'm going to simplify it down to 4 pathways if you're interested in how the heck could this concept like purpose be associated with these health outcomes. First of all, there's a resilience effect that I'm going to describe. We really are a translational neuroscience company at Kumanu, and I'll explain how we do that. Secondly, when people are focused in a certain way, they are going to be more open to change, less conflicted, and from a kind of discipline perspective around their behaviors, they're taking a future orientation. So we won't dig any further than that, other than to say there are some pathways. And so here we are, in today's new reality, and we've got this virus, and instead of being in the workplace, you've got people in buildings that are not your work site. You're trying to figure out how to get those humans back into the work site. What is it about purpose that's operating in this moment? And so this is some quick surveillance that we've done with different organizations. If you were to get to the bottom of what are people feeling in this moment, and let's all be real, these are the feelings that are behind the behaviors that are behind our ability to deal with this pandemic. This is not surprising. It's frustration. It is sadness. It is worry. It is uncertainty. This is the backdrop for everything we're doing right now. And I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about how we go deeper than that using some interesting machine learning and AI to understand and then act on that. So let's start with the individual. A lot of the work we do, I mentioned translational neuroscience. If you were to put a person into an MRI machine, and this is in fact what we do in the labs that inform the technology we build, you can find something really interesting, that there's a dance between these two parts of our brain that impact our behavior. The first being this VMPFC, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You think of that as kind of your guru brain. It's right up front. It's very human. And then you've got that fear response coming from the amygdala. And so the dance that goes on when we're facing something fearful, like a global pandemic or thoughts of going back into a workplace and becoming infected, that fear response kicks in very naturally. It is an innate response we have. The reality, though, is are we going to be leaning in toward hoarding sanitizer, toilet paper, and buying guns? Or are we going to kind of allow the resilience effect? And this goes kind of straight to that issue of emotional health and well-being. We allow that resilience effect to kick in, and maybe we're starting to think about our role in helping others, our role in creating a safe workplace, our role in being a positive member of the community, because we're kind of all in this together. There's no way out of a pandemic without addressing these issues of human behavior, and there's no way to get the human behaviors aligned without getting people focused on doing the right thing. So what happens actually, and this is a composite brain scan that shows when you can get people focused, and I'm sure you've heard the term mindfulness, when that mindfulness is focused on a purposeful thought and by extension core values, you get this self-transcendent effect. And so people's willingness to lean in and do the right thing and be part of the solution is in large part a function of the ability to activate that part of our brains. And that really is the work that we do. Now, interestingly, let's step back from that. At the individual level, if we can get people activated, we can get them calm, we can get them doing the right things, we can get them part of the solution. How do we step back from that and look at that at an organizational level? And that's a lot of the interesting work we've been doing lately with client organizations. And so this is kind of a clumsy graphic of if you could put your company into that same MRI machine, what would you see? And so I'm going to share with you an analysis that actually we have not shared before. We're actually about to share it with the client this afternoon. This is machine learning on the surveillance we've done through an app we call Purposeful that people use day in and day out, and it ties to a larger information platform. And we wanted to look at the ability to detect what's going on at a deeper substrate across about 7,400 data points. And these are not asking a person an explicit question, what emotion are you feeling? This is quite literally plucking out of textual data where they're sort of doing some light journaling and doing some self behavior modification, and they're doing mindfulness exercises. We're pulling on an anonymized basis these insights using Google's lexicon to try to detect what's going on, and then layer upon that moves that management is making, as well as events going on out in the environment, to see whether we can see what the patterns look like. And so I'm going to share this with you. I think this is what kind of hooked Jeff and team in terms of the work we do as another dimension of surveillance. And you can see on the left-hand panel here, this is the inference of anger. And I'm going to read because it may be a little hard for you to see what's at the top of this graph. But we did a time series analysis, and you can see this sentiment moving through the population, kind of moving upward as we get into mid-March. And suddenly it's very clear that we're in a bad situation, and it's potentially spinning out of control. You see at the peak, that first mountain peak, a CEO call. That was the first time that the leader of that organization got on an all hands and said, here's what we're going to do. And so very immediately that anger drops back down, and then it starts rising up again. And they get clear with their organization. Here's our strategy for reopening. Here's how we're approaching that. Anger goes down again. Now, here's something that you can't control as an organization. Suddenly we have George Floyd, and we have protests in the street, and we have this social unrest, and you can see anger going way back up again. Again, some of these things you can control, some things you can't, but here is a way to see where is the sentiment of the organization. Similarly, you can track this sense of burnout. And in many ways, this constant living in WebEx and Zoom and this always on video is leading to quite a bit of burnout. And you can start modulating and seeing the effect of moves that management is making, that leaders are making on those emotions. Similarly, though, there are positive sentiments being expressed, and connectedness. Obviously, we're leaving the office setting, things are going badly, and connectedness is going down. But it turns around there. Something interesting is happening, by the beginning of May, and I'm not clear on what that is, but clearly there's a turnaround effect. And similarly, gratitude is moving up and down. And so these are the analyses we're doing at the organizational level to try to put people who are making decisions for the organization in the shoes of their people. Because just to kind of echo what's been said by the other speakers, you kind of have to step back and look at this in connection to the whole system. To kind of put a bow on this, as you think about how do you make the business case for a deeper level of surveillance, I think you do have to look holistically at the experience of employees and begin connecting the dots between maybe the narrow view of OC health and surveillance and our response to COVID and the broader arc of how we're going to build kind of that authentic experience. And I think at the top of Jeff's list was trust. Part of it is that authenticity with which you approach the employee population. Hopefully this was interesting for you. I look forward to getting into the Q&A part of this, but I appreciate the chance to share a little bit about what we've been up to at a kind of a deeper level of surveillance with employee populations. Back to you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric, and nice way to really bring things back home and come back to that, one of those early points we made about the importance of employee trust. And you guys kind of have a new way to look at sentiment that's very interesting. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here in a pretty short period of time, but we do have a little bit of time left for questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Bhargav to facilitate Q&A with the group. And remember, you can pose questions using the chat feature in WebEx. And we'll get to as many as we can here over the next 15 minutes or so. So Bhargav.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was an incredible set of presentations and a lot of information we've covered. So let's just get right into it. We've understood the importance of on occupational health EMR. I'd like to start with Paul. Could you talk a little bit about, from a global perspective, what has been the learning curve for providers to start using an occupational health EMR if they're not familiar with an EMR and they've been used to using paper, or I think a lot of people on this call may be using traditional ambulatory EMRs that are not designed for occupational health. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the learning curve and what role does it play in addressing employee fears about returning work in this COVID world?
Sure. Well, I think, in terms of the first part of the question, getting people used to using EMR when they've been used to using paper is a challenge without a shadow of a doubt. And I think having a good, systems manager on board as part of the integrated health services team has really worked very well. I think ERM did a good job up until the point of spin, but then we were sort of on our own, and some things were picked up straight away, and other things we've had to go back and pick up again. And we're even 1 year down the line, we're doing regular online trainings for the different regions that are using the EMR to make sure people are familiar with it. We're also evolving the way that people are using EMR, so we're starting to produce more interesting data. So, for example, as I showed on my metrics slide, the most basic use was to record the total number of visits we've had, but now we're developing that into what are the reasons people are actually coming along to be seen in the clinics, and particularly that's proved useful when we think about COVID-19 consultation. So, I would say it's an evolution, it's an iterative process. You can't, say, here's the training manual, have a quick look at that, and I'm expecting you to completely move over to doing things electronically by next Friday. That's certainly not going to work. It's a whole change management process and making sure, that we're answering people's questions and going back and revisiting areas that were probably, it was probably for our occupational health staff, everything was done under this timeline of the spin-off of the new company. It was probably a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose. So, they would have picked up the basics, but not some of the more interesting ways to use the system and producing more interesting data, which ultimately helps them in making the business case, both at the global level, but right down to the site level for the work that we're actually doing to support the organization. As part of overcoming fears, I think it is very interesting to look at people's reactions to the thought of coming back to work. Obviously, you have one group of people who can't wait to get back to work, and another part of the organization, and a substantial part of the organization, who is really fearful of coming back to the workplace. And quite often you find, they've either got somebody at home who lives with them who are in one of these chronic disease categories where COVID can be more severe, or indeed they themselves are dealing with one of those chronic diseases. So I think, the approach we've taken in Corteva is to really have a transparent and data driven approach. So our communications team has done a very good job over the past few months, and we've had a number of CEO town halls, which I believe has had the effect that Eric was demonstrating in terms of putting people's mind at ease. So we've been very transparent, and that's included our approach to returning to work. We've distributed detailed information to all our employees about what we're monitoring in terms of the trends in COVID cases in the locations around our workplaces. How are we going to monitor those trends over time? Are there cutoff levels below which we say it's safe to come back to work? But not only just stopping at that. Do we have enough personal protective equipment for the employees to return to site? Are the hospitals able to cope with anybody who does become sick? Are they back to, working out of crisis mode? Being able to do elective surgery, for example, is a good indication that they're not overwhelmed. And finally, taking advantage of any tracking apps, but also local public health need to be in a position where they're going to track any new cases. I think if you combine all those together, it starts reassuring people that we're really creating a workplace that is going to be safer for them to visit than almost any other place outside their home. Where we've talked about this at many points, because obviously we had workers coming in during lockdowns and they wanted to know they were safe, and wouldn't it be safer to just close the factory and stay at home? Emphasizing the important point that we were part of the food chain was helpful, but really reassuring them that they were safer there than, for example, going down to the local food store where people haven't been trained on social distancing, people haven't been provided with the right sort of mask. What face coverings do in terms of protecting people is anybody's guess. So in a workplace, they're either socially distancing or using an approved mask. And I think to come to the part of your question that you asked, how does EMR help with that? It helps with the transparency. So all throughout this progression, people have been interested in the number of cases we've had. And I think the electronic medical record system has helped us provide that data, but it will become even more important as we go forward, that we're reassuring people with the steps we're taking, but then we're actually proving that we've got a very low rate of cases within the workforce and helping them to reassure in that way. So hopefully that answers the two parts of your question.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is employees want to know what information they give you. Certainly in the US, there's no requirement to disclose medical information to their employer, but if they do disclose, they want to make sure it's protected and siloed away from, like Samir mentioned, some of the other systems in the company, so the information is protected. I think sometimes companies do get stuck in pushing information and maybe not pulling as much as they should, and having sort of check-ins on how the information is landing with their employees, which is sort of where Eric comes in. Eric, really fascinating stuff. Can you talk a little bit, and this might be, I don't know if you can do this, but I noticed you have a webinar tomorrow on Kumanu on sort of AI-driven heat maps of sentiment.
Mhm.
And so what do companies, or how should they be approaching this to see, just going off of that fear of coming back to work, depending on the company, it may be completely voluntary or a little bit more stronger of a requirement to come in. So how should companies be doing this in a sensitive way?
It's a really important question, and I think it may have been Paul earlier said this is not about returning to work, right? We've all been working incredibly hard. It's about returning into a physical space together, and I think it's quite frankly going to be a fairly individualistic decision. Our office is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I actually live in the San Francisco Bay Area, very close to the Silicon Valley, and I've observed that a lot of organizations, particularly here in the Bay Area, are taking a go slow approach and realizing that the nature of the work may not require people to be face to face, and it's actually going okay. And let's not, press on the gas too fast. I think it has to be evaluated situationally. And I can just speak for our own company. We've taken the approach that we're not going to push people beyond their comfort level. The reality is we all have a personal story. I may be well and resilient, and I may have someone in the home who is immunosuppressed. So you have to sort of be very sensitive to individuals and flexible in this moment. So I don't think there's a one size fits all solution. I do think having good data can be helpful. And I think that data needs to include both things like infection rates, but also sentiment.
Thank you. And just going off of that, Samir, if we could switch to what you mentioned about I think we all agree 2020 has become the year of the virtual worker, and employees are finding it, and employers are finding it even harder to stay engaged with their employees. Paul mentioned the CEO scorecard and how he's happy, and I think a lot of us share that sentiment if we can get on that scoreboard. In your experience, what has been a successful approach for clients you've worked with to get on that CEO scoreboard?
I think it's linked back to really kind of demonstrating what value EHS and occupational health in particular has to the broader business, and I think the way to you've got to balance this out. It's not all about because when you take that risk avoidance route, sometimes it becomes a little bit like you just bringing the worst case scenario here every time we talk to you. And the idea is no, it's about all the other things you can do. So just like Eric kind of identified, or even as Paul kind of demonstrated, you've got the more we can do on that left-hand side of the screen to be preventative, the less you're going to have to do on the right-hand side of the screen, which is having to address an issue that's already come up. So I think the way that's worked most effectively for us is really to connect what the occupational health of the EHS group does with the broader strategic value of the company. So Corteva is a really interesting case in point, just because it is a agri-science company. The impact that healthy, productive worker has in that space is different. The impact the sustainability has for Corteva is different than another company. So again, ensuring that you're aligning some of the things you're doing with the business and the corporate strategy, because that's what the CEO is trying to do. The CEO is trying to identify the 3 to 5 metrics that actually tells him or her what the health of the business is. It's like driving a car, right? So you have those 4 things on your dashboard. You don't put a random thing up there just because it's interesting. You do it because it actually tells you how your car is running and what the performance of your vehicle is. And that's exactly what has been successful for us, really demonstrate that metric actually has an impact on the performance and the health check of the organization. So that's been the most successful way for us to do that.
So when you talk about cost and risk avoidance, I imagine you're pointing more towards, and please correct me if I'm wrong, injuries and sort of high potential, high potency, bad sort of events that happen in the company. What about for large self-insured employers, especially in the United States, that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on healthcare costs, both in the personal, medical, as well as the workers' comp, and I'm sure just from lost productivity might sometimes harder to measure. But these are all real medical costs. That's not necessarily avoidance. It's happening, and the U.S.'s ability to control healthcare costs has been abysmal. So, how do we explain to companies and to especially C-suite that this is a huge cost for your employees and is a potential way to both improve health, employee health as well as your reputation?
I mean, it's interesting actually. Some of the things you've just described are sometimes extremely siloed. So the workers' comp is in a different section and is dealing with all the costs that you've just said, which is not directly being linked to the impact of a new system or a new approach in the EHS or in the occupational health group. So that's one of the big, which is the kind of thing that I mentioned, is really expanding the scope of what you're doing and being able to connect some of these silos, so that as you rightly said, I would argue some of the some countries decided to make certain choices on sustainability and so forth, given the overall cost that they looked at, the total cost to the enterprise, as opposed to an individual functions budget. But that's a little bit of how the budgeting process works, right? So in terms of saying, well, that's what you believe your budget needs to be, and I think where we've been successful, Parker, is it making those links, is being able to demonstrate at the C-suite level that by making the following investment, like some of the things that Eric was identifying, that's actually going to have an impact on Paul's budget, and that might not be readily apparent. Depending on just how the procurement process and how the business case process might actually work in certain organizations. I think the organizations that have been able to streamline that, either within an operations lead or within an HR lead, where they're able to look across those various different silos, we're a lot more effective, because those are real numbers. It's not if you don't do this, this will happen. It is, you're already doing this, and this is what you're spending. So here's a way to actually impact that spend.
Thank you. And just going off of budget and just switch gears a little bit into business continuity planning. I think most companies have been sort of caught off guard on what is happening globally and the value of occupational health, and they're trying to scale up the capability as well as the reach of the sometimes small function, so they can provide a global level of support. Can you share an example where you've seen a client, or even certain companies that may not have been affected as much with COVID, and how they've planned appropriately by investing in employee health, and how it's paying off now?
Was that for me, Bhargav? Or?
Yes, Samir, please.
No problem. So a couple. I think you saw one example right now on the call with Paul, in terms of just the investment. Now again, Paul would probably agree that there was he had the opportunity to do that because he was doing that startup of this new organization and able to build some things from scratch and make some key choices. And I think we've seen similar cases where, as I mentioned in my example, the global pharma company, where they had invested in the infrastructure to be able to build some of the digital aspects that needed to be done on top of that. The reverse is we've had similar conversations with others where they didn't have the infrastructure built. They were caught off guard and had to really struggle through the process, and that led to some very interesting conversations. Jeff referred to it as well, where we're saying, okay, how can we kind of put this in place? But now the economic environment is not really conducive to make the appropriate investments in some cases. So they're starting to put some band-aids. So again, I think the examples where we've seen this has been areas where we've been able to demonstrate the impact that infrastructure like this will have, not just on the compliance piece and the maintaining kind of the employee health, but demonstrating how doing that is actually going to make the overall company more productive. And I think what we've been able to show is, whether you're a knowledge company, and in some ways I would argue maybe all companies are knowledge companies, but whether you're knowledge companies or you're company more classic manufacturing, that healthy employee, both mind and body, I think is a key a component of making that a success. So I think increasingly what we've been able to find is this initial investment. I think is critical, and I think Eric, you spoke about the second wave. The second wave is really something that we need to think about and hopefully help companies make that investment so that they're ready, because this is not going away in a hurry. And I think ensure that they're actually able to make that investment in time to make sure that the next time, and there is going to be a next time of something else, they're not caught off guard.
Thank you, Samir.
Well, hey guys, I hate to cut off this great conversation, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So this has been a great discussion, great exchange of ideas. I want to thank all of our panelists, Kel, Paul, Samir, and Eric. I know you guys are very busy, and we appreciate you guys preparing and presenting and answering questions. Very well done. Thanks also, Bhargav, for moderating. And I wish we had a lot more time, because I think we could probably talk about this topic all day long. But thanks to all of you as well for attending today's session. We know this is a busy time, so it's very much appreciated. We will be sending out a link to access a recording of this webinar along with some follow-up materials, so look for that in your inboxes either late this week or early next. But again, thanks all of you, and everyone stay safe and be well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.